The mines looked fake. Bright yellow painted tin cans scattered across the entire approach road to Tula, hundreds of them visible from a kilometer away, positioned with such obvious regularity that Oberleutnant Franz Weber stared through his binoculars and felt his stomach tighten with the same nervousness that had kept him alive through 3 months of fighting in Russia. His Panzer III company had been advancing well for 3 days, with minimal Soviet resistance and small skirmishes with retreating defenders, the kind of easy progress that made experienced commanders nervous because nothing in Russia was ever actually easy. Now his entire tank company sat stopped on the road for 90 minutes because of what appeared to be mines but looked too obvious to be real. Real minefields were hidden and camouflaged and designed to be invisible until you drove over them and died instantly. But these mines looked like someone had painted tin cans yellow and scattered them across the ground in patterns visible from aircraft altitude. Which was probably exactly what they were. Probably Soviet desperation made visible. Probably worthless decoys that would waste German time without destroying German tanks. But Weber couldn't be sure about that assessment, and couldn't risk being wrong. One real mine, hidden among the hundreds of fakes, would destroy his tank and kill his crew, and end his advance into Tula. So he waited while his engineers moved forward carefully and slowly to check each suspicious object, determining which were actual mines and which were decoys, testing with metal detectors and probes, and the kind of methodical verification that took time. Hours of time that the advance was losing while sitting exposed on an open road where Soviet artillery could find them if observers were watching. Behind his position, 23 more tanks waited in formation. An entire company stopped and delayed and wasting combat time on what was probably nothing but possibly deadly. And that uncertainty, that forced hesitation, was exactly what the Soviets wanted to create. Exactly the psychological pressure that fake obstacles could impose on professional military forces who couldn't afford to assume threats were harmless without verification. 300 meters to Weber's left, concealed in a destroyed building that looked abandoned, Soviet artillery observers watched through binoculars and counted German tanks methodically, calculated firing ranges to different points along the road, waited for the perfect moment when German frustration would overcome German caution, waited for the panzers to decide the mines were fake and push forward without complete verification, and that's when the real weapons would open fire. Not the painted cans, but the artillery hidden in the hills, the anti-tank guns positioned in flanking locations that nobody was looking for because German attention was focused on the obvious fake mines in the road. This is the story of the laughed-at defense that stopped real tanks through pure psychology. The fake minefield that turned painted tin cans into effective defensive weapons. The deception that Soviet civilians created when they had no real weapons remaining. The psychological trick that exploited German professionalism and German caution, and the understanding that sometimes making enemies defeat themselves through their own hesitation is more effective than trying to destroy them through combat. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. October 24th, 1941. 5 days before Weber would sit staring at fake mines, and Colonel Vasily Chuikov stood before a map of Tula's defenses, trying to solve an impossible problem with inadequate resources. German forces were approaching from the south, with Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army bringing 200 tanks and 30,000 professional soldiers who had smashed through every Soviet defensive line for 3 months. They had captured Orel and surrounded Bryansk, and now they were coming for Tula with momentum and experience and equipment that Soviet forces couldn't match. Tula's defenses consisted of 12,000 men, with half of them civilian militia, factory workers given rifles and basic training, some with military experience, but most without any combat preparation. They had enthusiasm and patriotism and willingness to die defending their city. What they didn't have was anything that could stop German panzers from driving straight through their defensive positions. No anti-tank weapons in meaningful quantities, no mines to block approach routes, no obstacles that would force German forces into killing zones where Soviet rifles might matter. Zhukov had 3 anti-tank guns for defending an entire city against 200 German tanks. 3 functional weapons after everything else had been evacuated to Moscow or destroyed in earlier fighting, and the mathematics were brutally simple. Each gun might destroy 2 or 3 tanks before being overrun by German fire, which meant maybe 9 German tanks destroyed if everything went perfectly, leaving 191 tanks to capture the city through pure numerical superiority, and the defense would last maybe 4 hours or 6 hours if civilians fought with suicidal desperation before Tula fell and the road to Moscow opened completely. Unless Zhukov could find a way to stop tanks without weapons, could delay German forces without fighting them directly, could make them hesitate and fear and waste time through methods that didn't require artillery or mines or anything that Soviet forces didn't possess. Anything to buy hours or days for reinforcements to arrive or weather to change, or anything that might shift the impossible mathematics toward survivability. "We need mines," Major Dmitry Volkov said, with the frustration of an engineering officer who understood defensive requirements but lacked resources to implement them. "We need to block the approach routes and force the panzers into killing zones where our 3 anti-tank guns can have clear fields of fire." "We don't have mines," Zhukov replied, with the flat tone of someone stating obvious facts about impossible situations. "We have no mines at all because the stockpiles were evacuated to Moscow last week when they decided Tula wasn't strategically important enough to defend properly. We requested replacement munitions, and they said there were none available. Every mine in the Soviet Union is defending Moscow or Leningrad, while Tula gets nothing." "Then we need to make the Germans think we have mines," Volkov said, his engineering mind already working through the deception problem like a technical challenge. "Need to create fake minefields that look convincing enough from distance to force German verification. Need to slow them down with psychological pressure rather than actual obstacles." Zhukov looked at him with the expression of someone hearing a desperate idea that might actually work. "Fake minefields using what materials? We don't have explosives to create fake mines that would fool German engineers upon close inspection." Volkov thought about it while staring at the map and trying to imagine what would work against German reconnaissance. "We need something that looks like mines from a distance, but doesn't need to fool close inspection because the Germans won't get close enough to examine them carefully. Something visible enough that German spotters notice it immediately, something suspicious enough that German commanders stop their advance to investigate rather than driving through without verification." "Like what specifically?" "Tin cans," Volkov said, the idea forming as he spoke it out loud. Empty food tins painted bright yellow to look like anti-tank mines, scattered across the approach routes in patterns that suggest deliberate minefield placement. Germans see bright yellow objects in regular patterns, and they have to assume mines until they verify otherwise, and verification takes time. Hours of time if we scatter enough cans across enough road to make the task impossible to complete quickly. Zhukov stared at him for a long moment, trying to determine if this was genius or insanity. "You want to defend Tula with painted garbage? You think German tank commanders will stop for tin cans?" "I think German tank commanders are professionals who know that one real mine hidden among 1,000 fake ones will destroy a 30-ton panzer and kill its crew," Volkov said, with increasing confidence as he worked through the psychology. "They can't afford to assume obstacles are harmless without verification because the cost of being wrong is catastrophic. We don't need to fool them into thinking all the obstacles are real. We just need to make them unwilling to assume all the obstacles are fake. That uncertainty will force verification, and verification takes time, and time is what we need. The plan was desperate and absurd, and based on exploiting enemy caution rather than enemy weakness. But it was also the only plan available to forces with 3 anti-tank guns defending against 200 tanks. Chuikov authorized it immediately because desperate situations required desperate solutions, and painted tin cans were better than nothing when nothing was the alternative. The implementation began that afternoon with civilian volunteers from Tula's factories gathering every empty tin can from the city's garbage. Food tins and oil cans and any metal container roughly the size of anti-tank mines, thousands of them collected from homes and restaurants and military kitchens. Factory workers painted them bright yellow, using industrial paint supplies that weren't needed for weapon production, because there were no weapons being produced. A woman named Maria Sokolova worked in one of the painting crews, standing in a factory yard with a brush and bucket of yellow paint and a pile of empty tin cans. She was 38 years old and worked normally as a lathe operator in the arms factory, but the factory had been evacuated to the Urals along with its machinery, leaving her unemployed in a city about to be attacked. Painting tin cans yellow seemed absurd as military contribution, but it was something she could do with the skills and materials available. "This is stupid," another woman said while painting cans alongside Maria. "The Germans will see through this immediately. They're not going to stop for painted garbage." "They'll stop," Maria said with more confidence than she felt. "They have to stop because they can't know if all of them are fake without checking, and checking takes time. That's the point. Buying time for real defenses to arrive, or weather to change, or anything that makes tomorrow different from today." The painting continued through the night, with hundreds of civilians working in shifts to paint thousands of tin cans bright yellow. By morning October 25th, they had created what looked like a massive supply of anti-tank mines, thousands of bright yellow cylinders that from a distance could pass for Soviet TM-41 mines or German Tellermine derivatives. The visual similarity was crude, but potentially effective if German observers saw the objects from several hundred meters away, rather than close inspection distance. The placement began at dawn, with teams of civilians carrying the painted cans to approach routes that German tanks would use to reach Tula. Scattered them across roads and fields in patterns that suggested deliberate minefield layout, regular intervals, and geometric arrangements that implied military planning rather than random distribution. Positioned them to be visible from German reconnaissance positions, bright yellow objects that would stand out against brown Russian earth and dead vegetation. By noon, October 25th, the fake minefields were complete across 5 different approach routes to Tula, thousands of painted tin cans creating the visual appearance of massive mine defenses that didn't exist, psychological obstacles that cost almost nothing to create, but might buy hours or days of delay if German commanders took them seriously enough to verify before advancing. October 29th, and Oberleutnant Weber sat in his Panzer III, staring at the bright yellow objects covering the road ahead. His company had been advancing rapidly until encountering this obvious obstacle that looked fake, but might be deadly. And now he faced the tactical dilemma that Soviet planners had intended to create: drive forward without verification and risk hitting real mines hidden among the fakes, or stop and verify every suspicious object and waste hours while Soviet forces used the delay to prepare real defenses. He chose verification because professional military training emphasized caution over speed when facing potential mine threats. Called forward his engineer platoon to check the obstacles methodically using metal detectors and probes, began the slow process of determining which objects were real mines and which were painted tin cans. The first check took 12 minutes and confirmed that the bright yellow object was an empty tin can with no explosive content. The second check took 11 minutes and found another empty can. The third check found the same, and the pattern continued with German engineers discovering that every object they examined was painted garbage rather than actual explosive. But they couldn't stop checking because the possibility remained that real mines were hidden among the fakes, scattered in patterns designed to punish forces that stopped verifying after confirming the first dozen obstacles were harmless. Soviet doctrine would suggest exactly that tactic, mixing real threats among fake ones to exploit enemy assumptions about pattern consistency. Weber's company lost 2 hours on the road, verifying obstacles that were entirely fake, 2 hours during which Soviet forces used the delay exactly as intended. Artillery observers tracked German positions and calculated firing solutions. Anti-tank gun crews repositioned to better locations. Infantry units established defensive positions in buildings that overlooked the approach routes. When German engineers finally confirmed the entire minefield was fake and Weber ordered his company forward, they advanced into a defensive zone that was significantly more prepared than it had been 2 hours earlier. The fake mines had bought time for real defenses to organize, had created delay that Soviet forces converted into tactical advantage through better positioning and coordination. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation, because German forces now faced uncertainty about every suspicious object they encountered. The bright yellow tin cans had established that Soviet forces were willing to use elaborate decoys to impose verification costs on advancing units, which meant every subsequent obstacle required serious consideration rather than dismissive assumption of harmlessness. German tank commanders began reporting extensive Soviet mine defenses to headquarters based on the visual evidence of bright yellow objects covering approach routes. Intelligence analysts assessed that Tula was more heavily fortified than previous estimates suggested given the apparent scale of mine defenses, and operational planning adjusted to account for the perceived threat. Guderian's staff began allocating additional engineer resources to dealing with Soviet mine defenses that largely didn't exist except as painted tin cans. The cumulative delay across multiple German units encountering fake minefields added up to significant time lost in the advance on Tula. Hours became half-days became full days, and each day of delay allowed Soviet defensive preparations to improve incrementally. Reinforcements arrived from Moscow in small numbers. Weather began changing toward winter conditions. German supply lines stretched further beyond sustainable logistics. October 30th, and German forces finally confirmed through multiple reconnaissance reports that most Soviet mine defenses were fake, that the bright yellow objects were painted tin cans rather than actual explosives. Some German officers laughed at Soviet desperation and ordered aggressive advances that would ignore suspicious objects rather than wasting time on verification. That's when the psychological trap sprung completely, because Soviet forces had positioned real anti-tank weapons in locations protected by the fake minefields that German forces were now ignoring. German tanks advancing confidently through what they assumed were entirely fake obstacles drove directly into carefully prepared ambush positions where actual Soviet guns could engage at close range. 11 German tanks were destroyed in these ambushes over 2 days because their commanders had learned the wrong lesson from the fake minefields, had concluded that all Soviet obstacles were psychological tricks, rather than recognizing that fake obstacles were being used to mask real defenses, that the painted tin cans were camouflage for actual anti-tank positions rather than standalone deception. The pendulum swung between excessive caution that wasted time verifying harmless obstacles and excessive aggression that ignored real threats hidden among fake ones. German forces couldn't find the correct balance because Soviet deception had made the tactical environment fundamentally uncertain, had created situations where both caution and aggression resulted in negative outcomes. November 5th, and Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberian reserves, with the 50th Army bringing fresh troops and actual anti-tank weapons and real defensive capabilities that Tula hadn't possessed 10 days earlier. Guderian assessed the new situation and calculated that capturing Tula would cost more resources than the city was worth strategically, ordered withdrawal, and redirected his forces toward other objectives. Tula had held through deception rather than firepower, through psychological pressure rather than military superiority. The fake minefields created with painted tin cans had bought enough time for real defenses to develop, had imposed enough delay for reinforcements to arrive and weather to change and German logistics to collapse. The worthless obstacles had proven invaluable as psychological tools, as delay mechanisms, as proof that defensive success doesn't require destroying enemies if you can make them hesitate long enough for other factors to matter. After the war, German officers were interviewed about Tula and asked why professional tank forces were delayed by obvious decoys. Hauptmann Schneider, the engineer who discovered the fake mines, explained with the insight of someone who had learned expensive lessons about psychological warfare. "We weren't fooled by the painted cans," Schneider said during a 1952 interview. "We knew they were probably fake from the moment we saw them because real mines aren't painted bright yellow and scattered in visible patterns. But probably isn't certainly. And one real mine hidden among 1,000 fakes would destroy a tank and kill 4 men. So we had to check each obstacle and verify it was harmless before ordering tanks forward. And checking took time that Soviets used to prepare real defenses. They didn't fool us. They made us cautious. And caution in warfare often means hesitation, and hesitation means losing opportunities. That interview revealed the genius of Tula's defense, because the fake minefields weren't designed to fool German forces into thinking obstacles were real. They were designed to force verification that would impose delay regardless of whether Germans believed the obstacles were genuine or fake, designed to exploit the professional caution that prevented tank commanders from gambling with their crews' lives by assuming suspicious objects were harmless without proof. The tactic spread through the Red Army as other Soviet commanders learned about Tula's success with painted tin cans. Other cities adopted fake obstacle techniques using whatever materials were available, creating fake anti-tank ditches and fake gun positions and fake fortifications that imposed verification costs on advancing German forces without requiring actual defensive weapons. The Battle of Tula became a case study taught at military academies after the war as demonstration of defensive deception principles. The painted tin cans became symbols of Soviet ingenuity and civilian contribution to military defense, became proof that cheap tricks could defeat expensive weapons if applied correctly with understanding of enemy psychology. But Maria Sokolova, who painted cans in the factory yard, never knew how famous her work became because she died in 1943 during a different battle. Her contribution to Tula's defense was never officially recognized or awarded or celebrated. She was just one civilian among thousands who painted cans and hoped it would help defend their city. The laughed-at defense that stopped real tanks through psychological pressure rather than physical destruction. The mocked obstacles that proved more effective than actual mines could have been because they imposed caution without requiring explosive materials. The fake minefield that exploited German professionalism by forcing verification that consumed time while Soviet forces prepared real defensive positions. Soviet civilians created the defense with what they had when they had nothing else. No real weapons, no actual mines, just tin cans and paint, and understanding that psychological pressure could delay armies as effectively as physical obstacles. That fear of potential danger could stop tank advances as much as actual danger. That making enemies cautious was sometimes better than making enemies dead. German commanders laughed when they discovered the mines were painted garbage and mocked Soviet desperation for using obvious decoys as defensive weapons. But they stopped laughing when artillery hit them from positions that nobody was watching for, because German attention was focused on verifying fake mines, stopped laughing when they realized the trick had worked by exploiting their own professionalism rather than their gullibility. That was the lesson that Tula taught about defensive warfare and psychological operations. That success doesn't require destroying enemies if you can delay them long enough for other factors to matter. That fake obstacles can accomplish delay as effectively as real ones if designed to exploit enemy decision-making rather than enemy perception. That painted tin cans scattered across approach routes can stop panzer divisions if the psychology is sound even when the physics is absent. The fake minefield that was more effective than real mines because it imposed hesitation rather than destruction. The psychological weapon that proved wars are won not just by killing enemies, but by making them waste time until opportunity passes. The civilians who understood that garbage could become defensive tools if it created uncertainty in enemy minds. The laughed-at wall that defended Tula. The mocked solution that actually worked. The painted cans that bought time for real defenses to matter. The psychological trick that stopped the German advance by making professional soldiers behave cautiously enough to lose their tactical windows. And the proof that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that makes enemies defeat themselves through their own reasonable caution. The deception's success created cascading effects through German operational planning that extended far beyond the immediate tactical delays at Tula. Intelligence reports about extensive Soviet mine defenses influenced how German commanders assessed other defensive positions throughout the Moscow approach, created expectations that Soviet forces had more resources available than actually existed. Every subsequent obstacle encountered by German forces required serious consideration rather than dismissive assumptions, created verification costs that accumulated across the entire operational theater. German engineers developed new protocols for dealing with Soviet deception after the Tula experience, protocols that involved using artillery to blast suspicious areas before advancing or using tanks to test routes by deliberately driving through potential mine zones at speed. These aggressive verification methods sometimes worked effectively, but also created new vulnerabilities when Soviet forces anticipated the tactics and positioned real weapons to exploit the predictable German responses. The pendulum of tactical decision-making swung between excessive caution that wasted time and excessive aggression that incurred casualties, and German forces never found the optimal balance because Soviet deception had made the tactical environment fundamentally uncertain. Every decision about how to handle suspicious obstacles involved trade-offs between time and safety, between operational tempo and force preservation, and neither choice was clearly superior across all situations. The fake minefield tactic proved so effective that Soviet forces adopted it systematically across other defensive positions throughout the winter of 1941 to 1942. Other cities facing German advances created their own fake obstacles, using whatever materials were available, improvised decoys that ranged from sophisticated to crude, but that all accomplished the same psychological objective of forcing German verification and imposing delay. Leningrad used painted logs to create fake anti-tank obstacles that appeared from distance to be substantial wooden barriers requiring engineer clearing. Moscow's outer defenses included fake anti-tank ditches that were actually shallow trenches covered with canvas painted to look like deep excavations, created visual impressions of extensive fortification that didn't match the physical reality. Stalingrad defenders later used similar deception techniques with fake gun positions and fake strongpoints that drew German attention and resources away from actual defensive locations. The cumulative effect of these deception operations was significant degradation of German operational confidence and decision-making speed. Every obstacle required evaluation and consideration even when commanders suspected it was fake, Every suspicious object imposed cognitive costs on tactical decision-makers who had to assess risks and benefits of different courses of action. The mental burden of constant uncertainty about what was real and what was fake contributed to the deteriorating effectiveness of German forces as the campaign progressed into winter conditions. Maria Sokolova continued working in various civilian defense roles after painting tin cans during the Tula defense, contributed to construction of actual fortifications and medical support for wounded soldiers. She never knew how famous her painted cans became in military analysis of the battle, never learned that her work was cited in post-war studies of defensive deception and psychological warfare. Died in 1943 during German artillery bombardment of a different city, without ever understanding that her contribution to military history was painting garbage that stopped tanks. After the war, the painted tin cans were swept away and discarded because they had served their temporary purpose and had no value beyond their immediate psychological effect. No museums preserved examples of the fake mines. No monuments commemorated the civilian contribution to Tula's defense through deception rather than combat. The physical objects disappeared, but the lessons remained in military doctrine about how psychological pressure can substitute for physical weapons when resources are scarce and creativity is abundant. German officers interviewed after the war about their experiences at Tula consistently mentioned the fake minefields as examples of effective Soviet tactical deception that exploited German professional caution. Hauptmann Schneider's comments in 1952 reflected the broader understanding that had developed among veterans about how psychological warfare could impose real costs through uncertainty rather than actual danger. The Soviets understood something that we didn't fully appreciate until too late, Schneider explained during his interview. They understood that making us cautious was as effective as making us casualties, that time we spent verifying fake threats was time we weren't advancing toward objectives, that psychological pressure could stop armies as effectively as physical obstacles if applied correctly. This understanding of how deception works through exploitation of enemy rationality rather than enemy stupidity became central to post-war military thinking about psychological operations and defensive warfare. The fake mines at Tula demonstrated that decoys don't need to fool anyone completely. They just need to create enough uncertainty to force verification that consumes time and resources. The lesson was simple but profound in its implications for how defenders with limited resources could contest superior attacking forces. The Battle of Tula entered military curriculum at staff colleges worldwide as case study in defensive psychology and resource-efficient deception. The painted tin cans became famous as example of how civilian ingenuity could contribute to military defense when conventional weapons were unavailable, how understanding enemy decision-making could substitute for matching enemy firepower. But the individual civilians who painted those cans remained anonymous in historical record, their names forgotten except in local memory that faded with passing generations. Maria Sokolova and hundreds of others who contributed to Tula's defense through deception rather than combat never received recognition or awards, never appeared in victory photographs or propaganda materials. They were just ordinary people who painted garbage and hoped it would help, who created psychological weapons with tin cans and yellow paint, and basic understanding that enemies who can't distinguish real threats from fake ones must treat all threats seriously. The laughed-at defense became respected tactic after Tula held against impossible odds. The mocked obstacles proved their worth through delay and psychological pressure that bought time for real defenses to arrive. The painted garbage demonstrated that effectiveness in warfare doesn't require sophistication or expense, sometimes just requires understanding enemy psychology well enough to exploit their rational caution against them. German commanders who initially laughed at painted tin cans stopped laughing when they realized the trick had worked, not by fooling them, but by forcing them to behave cautiously enough to lose their operational windows. Stopped laughing when they understood that Soviet forces had turned German professionalism into a vulnerability by creating situations where professional behavior meant defeat through delay. That was the ultimate lesson of Tula's fake minefields and the psychological warfare that saved the city. That defensive success doesn't require matching enemy strength if you can exploit enemy rationality. That painted garbage can stop tanks if it creates uncertainty that professional soldiers can't ignore. That wars are won not just through firepower, but through understanding how to make enemies defeat themselves by doing what their training says is correct. The civilians of Tula, who painted tin cans yellow, created one of the most effective defensive systems of World War II, using materials that cost almost nothing and required no specialized skills. They proved that psychological weapons can substitute for physical weapons when wielded by people who understand enemy decision-making, that ordinary people facing extraordinary threats can defend their homes through creativity when conventional defense isn't possible. The fake minefield that stopped Guderian's panzers. The painted cans that bought time for real defenses to matter. The psychological trick that exploited German professionalism to create strategic delay. The laughed-at defense that proved psychological pressure can be as effective as physical destruction when applied with understanding of enemy psychology and operational constraints. The strategic implications of Tula's defense extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, because the city's survival prevented German forces from achieving a clean breakthrough toward Moscow during the critical window when weather still permitted offensive operations. Each day of delay at Tula was a day that German logistics deteriorated and Soviet defenses around Moscow strengthened, was a day closer to winter conditions that would fundamentally change the operational environment in ways that favored defenders over attackers. Soviet military leadership studied the Tula defense carefully and recognized that the fake minefield tactic had contributed significantly to buying the time needed for strategic reinforcements to arrive. Marshal Zhukov specifically cited Tula as example of how creative defensive measures could offset enemy superiority in conventional military resources, how psychological warfare could substitute for physical firepower when wielded intelligently by forces that understood enemy decision-making patterns. The tactic was systematized and distributed to other Soviet defensive positions through official military channels, with engineering officers receiving instructions on how to create effective fake obstacles using locally available materials. The guidance emphasized that fake obstacles needed to be ambiguous rather than convincing, needed to force enemy verification rather than deceiving enemy observers, needed to exploit professional military caution rather than relying on enemy stupidity. German forces adapted their tactics in response to widespread Soviet use of fake obstacles, but the adaptations themselves created new vulnerabilities that Soviet forces learned to exploit. When German units used artillery to blast suspicious areas before advancing, they revealed their positions to Soviet observers and consumed ammunition on targets that often didn't exist. When German tanks drove aggressively through suspected fake obstacles to maintain operational tempo, they sometimes hit real mines or drove into prepared ambushes that exploited the predictable aggressive response. The psychological dimension of modern warfare that Tula's defense highlighted became increasingly important as both sides recognized that battles weren't just about destroying enemy forces, but about influencing enemy decision-making through uncertainty and deception. Soviet forces became particularly adept at this psychological approach because their resource constraints forced creativity, forced development of tactics that could achieve military objectives without requiring massive expenditures of ammunition and equipment. The painted tin cans at Tula represented a broader Soviet innovation in defensive warfare that prioritized psychological pressure over physical destruction, that recognized how creating uncertainty could be as effective as creating casualties when facing enemies who were professionally trained to avoid unnecessary risks. This approach to defense would influence Soviet military doctrine throughout the war and into the Cold War period, would become foundation for understanding how weaker forces could contest stronger ones through asymmetric methods that exploited enemy strengths as vulnerabilities. Colonel Chuikov, who commanded Tula's defense during the critical period, was promoted and eventually commanded Soviet forces at Stalingrad, where psychological warfare and defensive deception again played crucial roles in Soviet success. The lessons learned at Tula about how to defend cities with inadequate resources influenced how Stalingrad was defended, using every tactic, including extensive deception operations, that made German forces waste time and resources on fake threats, while real Soviet forces prepared devastating counterattacks. Major Volkov, who proposed the fake minefield concept, continued serving as engineering officer and developed other deception techniques that Soviet forces used throughout the war. His contribution to military innovation was never publicly recognized because the effectiveness of deception depends on enemies not understanding the methods being used against them. But internal Soviet military assessments credited him with developing psychological warfare tactics that saved thousands of lives by delaying enemy advances until reinforcements could arrive. The civilians of Tula, who participated in creating the fake defenses, returned to their normal lives after the city was saved, resumed work in factories and farms and schools without ever understanding how their painted tin cans had influenced military history. They had responded to desperate situation with whatever tools were available, had created psychological weapons without formal training in psychological warfare, had demonstrated that ordinary people could contribute to military defense through creativity, even when they lacked conventional military capabilities. The fake minefield tactics' success at Tula validated broader principle that defensive warfare doesn't require matching attackers' strength if defender can impose costs through uncertainty and delay. That principle became central to how smaller nations thought about defending against larger aggressive neighbors, became foundation for understanding how asymmetric warfare could allow weaker forces to survive against stronger ones through methods that exploited enemy caution and professional military culture. Historians who studied the Battle of Tula decades after the war consistently noted that the fake minefields were among the most cost-effective defensive measures of World War II when measured by the ratio of resources invested to operational impact achieved. Thousands of painted tin cans that cost almost nothing to produce had imposed delays worth days of operational time on German forces worth billions in military equipment and training, had demonstrated that creativity could substitute for industrial capacity when defending against overwhelming force. The lesson that Tula taught about psychological warfare and defensive deception remained relevant long after World War II ended, influenced how military forces thought about how to defend against technologically superior attackers. The principle that uncertainty could impose costs on professional military forces became foundation for various defensive doctrines and guerrilla warfare strategies that emphasized creating ambiguous situations where enemies couldn't distinguish real threats from fake ones without investigation that consumed time and resources,